Well, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is David Godwin, and I'm the coordinator for the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida. Today we're excited to have our guest speaker, Dr. Reed Noss, Provost Distinguished Research Professor at the University of Central Florida. Reed will be giving a presentation today discussing the need for maintaining an evolutionary fire regime in the southeastern coastal plain. I'd like to take just a moment to share a little bit of information about the program I work with, the Southern Fire Exchange. SFE is a regional program for fire science delivery in the Southeast. We're a collaborative between the University of Florida, Tall Timbers Research Station, and NC State University. And we're part of a very successful nationwide network of fire science exchanges that are hosted and funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. We exist to increase the availability and application of fire science for natural resource managers, and to serve as a conduit for fire managers to then share their information and science needs with folks in the science and research community. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Reed Noss. Reed is a naturalist, an ecologist, and conservation biologist who's worked in academia and in consulting. Currently, he is a Provost Distinguished Research Professor at the University of Central Florida, where he directs the Science and Planning and Conservation Ecology, or SPICE, laboratory. He's an elected Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and has served on many boards and advisory panels, including the Board of Governors of the Society for Conservation Biology, the Board of Trustees for the Florida chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and Florida's Acquisition and Restoration Council. He recently served as Vice Chair of a Federal Advisory Committee for the U.S. Climate Change Science Program. Reed has more than 300 publications, including 7 books, and has been highly cited throughout his career. His most recent book, Forgotten Grasslands of the South, Natural History and Conservation, was published in 2013 by Island Press. And he's currently working on a much-anticipated new book, Evolutionary Ecology of Fire in Florida and the Southeastern Coastal Plain, due out in 2018. His current and recent research has focused on the vulnerability of species and ecosystems to sea level rise, climate adaptation strategies, disturbance ecology, road ecology, and ecosystem conservation and restoration. And so with that, welcome Reed. We're excited to have you with us today, and just one moment as I pull up your slideshow.
Thank you, David, and thank you to everyone for joining this webinar today. I hope you can hear me okay. If not, I suspect David or someone will let me know. So the new book that I'm working on that David mentioned, Evolutionary Ecology of Fire in Florida and the Southeastern Coastal Plain, provides the material which I've extracted some of for this webinar today. And basically, the Southeastern Coastal Plain, as I think most of you know, is one of the regions on Earth that has a long history of fire, where fire has been a very important force of natural selection that has shaped the species and communities we see today. And I suspect that most of you will also be familiar with many or most of the facts that I mentioned today. But what I'm hoping I'm doing by placing these facts within a broader evolutionary and ecological context is to make the case for the antiquity of fire in this region and the importance of understanding that in order to develop management regimes today that attempt to mimic this evolutionary fire regime. So let me advance. So as Bill Platt and colleagues noted in this excerpt from a recent paper, the idea that it's important to understand historical fire regimes and attempt to mimic them when we can with management is a fairly new idea. It goes back, among some of the more far-sighted ecologists in North America to the early 20th century. But as far as being relatively well accepted within the fire management community, this is something that is still happening, still gaining ground. So many of you probably have heard that, and probably have seen yourself, that species richness endemism, and other qualities, biodiversity qualities, are extremely high in the southeastern coastal plain. And in fact, just last year, this region was recognized by Conservation International and the Critical Ecosystems Partnership Fund as one of the 36 global biodiversity hotspots based on its level of plant endemism in particular, but also vertebrate endemism, but also its level of threat. We have some 816 endemic plants in the coastal plain, plus many endemics in other groups. The cutoff for a global hotspot, which is fairly arbitrary, is 1,500, so we're well above that. A very important point, and let's see if I use my little pointer here. Important point is here. Bruce Story and Alan Weekly, two of the co-authors on the paper shown here, have determined that some 85% of the endemic plants in our region are associated with fire-dependent pine savannas, woodlands, and embedded communities such as depression wetlands. This is extremely high. I can't think of any other region worldwide that has so many endemics concentrated within highly frequent fire-dependent communities. And we've also suffered a high degree of habitat loss, about 86% of original vegetation and on the order of 96% of our savannas and woodlands. This is based on analyses by Jennifer Costanza, another co-author on this paper. So, you know, if we were living in North Dakota and managing fire there, it wouldn't matter so much if we screwed up. Not to bash North Dakota, but we wouldn't lose any endemic species. Extinctions would be unlikely. But if we're working in a region with such high local endemism, it's very important to get management right, or we could lose species. Now, species are adapted to fire regimes, not to fire per se, and there's many different aspects of fire regimes that we could potentially try to mimic, and you see some of these here, and I'll talk about most of these: frequency, seasonality, intensity, and severity, which are not the same thing, by the way. They can be even negatively correlated. Extent or size of the fire, and often neglected is the heterogeneity or patchiness of a fire. All of these are very important components. Now, if you're going to show that fire has a long history in a region, it's best to not make your case on any single body of evidence, but look for multiple lines of evidence. And we have that in the coastal plain. So I've listed several potential lines of evidence here. One is charcoal and sediments. And unfortunately, we don't have a good record for that. Even during times like the late Holocene and the current time that we know that fire is prevalent on the landscape, there's very little and sometimes no charcoal showing up in the sediments of lakes and bogs. And this has been a conundrum for savanna ecologists worldwide, that they're finding very little charcoal in the sediments of landscapes that we know burn frequently. And there's many reasons for this, but probably the most important is that surface fire regimes produce very little charcoal, especially of the type that ends up in lake sediments. You might also look for paleoclimate proxies. For example, sediment layers indicating different levels of runoff in different seasons, because seasonal climates with a distinct wet season and a distinct dry season, which are characteristic of savannas worldwide, are typically prone to fire because you produce a lot of fuels during the wet season, you then dry them out, and they're susceptible to ignition. I'll talk a little bit about fossils. We have ancient fossils in our region that we know are of species that are today fire adapted. Many vertebrates going back millions of years in our region are associated with savannas and other habitats that are fire maintained. High endemism, I've mentioned already, but these are concentrated, these endemics, within fire-prone ecosystems. And finally, another line of evidence is a very high incidence of fire adaptive traits among many of our extant species. And I'll come back to that. And another line of evidence is the existence of entire ecosystems that would not exist were it not for fire. And William Bond of South Africa and co-authors have called these fire-dependent ecosystems. They exist in regions where there's ample precipitation to have closed canopy forests, but instead we have savannas, woodlands, many other fire-dependent types, simply because we have fire. Now, I discuss in my upcoming book a number of different controversies. Here are three really big ones, which I can just touch on today. One is the influence of Native Americans on fire regimes, and especially if that influence were great enough to actually have some effect on the evolution of species. A second area of controversy is the importance of fire seasonality versus simply fire frequency. And this is a really big one. We all know now that frequent fire is important. More controversial is the importance of fire season. And then finally, this idea of pyrodiversity, or diversity in the various components of a fire regime, will beget biodiversity. And this is controversial globally if you look at the literature on this. So first, let me briefly address this issue of whether Native Americans or Indians changed fire regimes in the coastal plain enough to alter evolution. Well, I read a number of papers that I don't normally read. I scoured the archaeological literature, anthropological literature, as well as paleoecology, and was actually somewhat surprised to find out that the influence of Indians on fire regimes in our region was relatively minor until quite recently. And there's some reasons for this. Up here, as Pinter and co-authors pointed out, humans are most likely to change fire regimes in regions that contain vegetation that's likely to burn, that is highly flammable, but which are ignition limited. For example, have a very low incidence of lightning. That is not the case here. Pinter et al. Referred to some landscapes that are actually saturated with fire to the point that human ignitions will not do much. Now, personally, I do not conclude that our region is saturated with fire, but the most fire-exposed parts of the landscape possibly were prior to European settlement. Now, we know that Indians use fire for many purposes, going back at least to late archaic times, say around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, but unequivocal first-hand reports of landscape scale burning are lacking prior to the mid to late 1700s, when the Creek Indians came down from mostly northern Georgia and Alabama, parts of Tennessee, became ultimately the Seminoles and Miccosukee tribes in present-day Florida, and they started burning the landscape regularly, as they did previously in their homeland. There's a lot longer and more straightforward evidence for Indian burning in the Piedmont and in the land of the Cherokee in the southern Appalachians, but surprisingly little in the coastal plain until the creeks came down. Now, there's some local exceptions which I discuss in my book, but that's the general regional picture. A very important recent paper, which I think should have been in Science or Nature, but ended up in the Journal of Sustainable Forestry, by Mark Abrams and Greg Nowacki, who are very well-known fire historians. They looked at the entire eastern U.S., westward to the tallgrass prairie, during the Holocene. They found that climate dominated human activity, climate including lightning, as a control of fire regimes and vegetation during the early to middle Holocene. During the late Holocene, humans became the primary source of fire. Okay, not unexpected. However, there was one big exception to this pattern across eastern North America, and that's the southeastern coastal plain. This was the one region that they found really has not been affected significantly by anthropogenic burning. And they use all kinds of sources: pollen records, charcoal records, observations of early explorers, and so on. Basically, there's enough lightning here, again, to virtually saturate the landscape, where with or without Indian burning, the landscapes are going to burn frequently. And this, again, is still controversial, and it's probably a surprise to many people. We do know, and I'm sure all of you know, that we have a lot of lightning in this region. In fact, I live right in the dot right here, this violet-colored dot with the very highest lightning, cloud-to-ground lightning flash density in the conterminous U.S., the highest in North America, north of Mexico, basically. And so plenty of lightning to ignite fires prior to European settlement. And I'll mention some things that have changed that picture in a minute. Nevertheless, a number of authors over the years have claimed that the pre-settlement landscape prior to the arrival of Europeans was dominated by anthropogenic fire. In fact, some people claim across the entire continent of North America. Basically, there's no evidence for this. This best-selling book, 1491, by Charles Mann, okay, had this map. This is an excerpt from a larger map showing the entire Florida Peninsula, the Mississippi watershed, dominated by anthropogenic fire, as well as widespread forest clearance for agriculture across a lot of the rest of the coastal plain. One fire ecologist I know, Michael Power in Utah, asked Mann for his data, and sure enough, he doesn't have any. It's basically a picture that corroborates his preconceived notion about the importance of Indian burning and Indian activity in North America. There's really no evidence for this type of extensive landscape transformation prior, at least, to the arrival of the whites and then later the Seminoles down into the, and Miccosukee down into the coastal plain. And in fact, if we go back a long time, the vegetation of the coastal plain, the climate and the vegetation has been remarkably stable. And in fact, that's a main reason why we're a global biodiversity hotspot. It turns out that hotspots of endemism worldwide are regions with very similar climate. And so, for example, going back to the Middle Eocene, 45 million years ago, we have fossils from what was then and is still the coastal plain, in this case the Claiborne Formation in western Kentucky and Tennessee, that show plant formations very similar to what we have today. This quote from Graham here: on sandy flats but removed from the tidal influence, pinus with an understory of sable serenota type palms, these are palmettos, and ephedra, Mormon tea, which is still in the West Gulf coastal plain, were present. And we know that all these taxa are fire adapted. Now, I would not have used this term that was used by Graham here, the early sandpine scrub association. It's really more suggestive of something like our modern day pine flatwoods like you see here in Florida. So vegetation, very much like we have today in Florida, was present in the coastal plain for at least 45 million years, proceeding onward to the Miocene, which was a time of high fire activity, especially the later Miocene. But in this case, in the early Miocene, we see an artist's reconstruction based on available fossils of plants and animals from that period that portrays a pine savanna with some scattered oaks that's very reminiscent of what we'd see today if we walked out into these landscapes. Except for, of course, today we don't have the megafauna like the horses shown here. But this type of system has been around in the coastal plain for tens of millions of years. Moving ahead to the Pleistocene. Now here is where a lot of the controversy centers. Okay, you can see in green here are pulses of pine pollen. Okay, and they alternate over the record with pulses of oak pollen, among other taxa. Now, many people have interpreted this most recent rise or spike in pine pollen beginning about 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, depending on the subregion of the coastal plain, as indicative of the time that Indians started burning the landscape heavily and basically created the modern longleaf pine savanna association. At that time, when people first started suggesting this, we didn't have good fossil pollen records extending back more than about 15,000 to 20,000 years. So what we saw is this steady, pretty much steady increase in pine in those early records. Now, at some sites, we have a pollen record extending back to, a continuous pollen record extending back to 61,000 years. And what you see here is continuous cycling of pine versus oak dominance. They all were there the whole time. And in fact, the vegetation as a whole, as these authors, Grimm and co-authors pointed out, has not changed greatly. Simply the relative abundances have changed. This suggests that longleaf pine or its antecedent or an ecologically equivalent species has been dominant at many times in the past, alternating with various oak systems which might have been grasslands, such as the so-called dry prairie, which has Quercus minima, the dwarf live oak, as a major constituent, has been around for a long time, again showing the antiquity of fire. We know from animal fossils, for example, red cockaded woodpeckers in the coastal plain very strongly associated with longleaf pine. Further north, we see it more associated with a shortleaf pine, for example. But in Florida, we have fossils of red-cockaded woodpeckers going back to as far as 180,000 years ago, long before the first humans entered the region, which has now been pushed back to 14,500 years ago, with fossils from the Page-Ladson site in the Osceola River in the Florida Panhandle. Now, I'm mentioning Florida a lot, not just because I live there, but for a couple reasons. One, most of our fossil evidence, both plants and vertebrates, especially from the Pleistocene, actually does come from Florida. Florida has, for example, the best vertebrate fossil record in the entire eastern United States. But also, speaking of hotspots, Florida is the hottest spot within the North American coastal plain global biodiversity hotspot. As you can see in this particular graph from Estill and Cruzan, in this case, these are ranges overlaid of plants that exist in 25 or fewer counties. So narrow range or endemic, fairly narrow endemic plants. And you can see they're concentrated across eastern North America or the southeastern North America in Florida. And as pointed out earlier, Sorey and Weekly have shown that some 85% of these endemics are associated with frequently burned pine savannas and embedded communities, again suggesting a very long history of fire. Many of these plants are paleoendemics. In fact, the vast majority of the endemic plant genera in the coastal plain are monotypic. They have only one species, which is evidence of antiquity. Another line of evidence I've referred to earlier is fire adaptive traits, which, as Keeley and co-authors describe here, these are traits that actually provide a fitness advantage in high fire environments. And they vary quite a lot with fire regime, and I'll talk a little bit about this. But to underscore a point I made briefly earlier, species are not adapted to fire per se, but rather to the specific fire regimes that they have experienced during their evolutionary histories. And although there's some flexibility and fire regimes change over time, if a fire regime changes radically and quickly, we can expect that some species won't be able to keep up. They will go extinct. Thus the importance of, when we can, trying to mimic natural fire regimes. Now, there's many different categorizations of fire regimes. This is the categorization I'm using in my forthcoming book. Stand maintaining fires, also referred to as surface fires. They're generally low severity. They're the kind of fires that we find associated with grassland and savanna and woodland environments. Stand replacing fire, on the other hand, this actually removes the crown, the canopy or crown of the vegetation, whether it be a forest or a shrubland. And this is characteristic of a lot of our wooded or forested wetlands, shrubby wetlands, as well as the Florida scrub community. Then we have smoldering fires, and these regimes all overlap. We can have more than one regime in a single landscape, for example. But smoldering fires are ground fires that can burn organic soils over long periods. In some parts of the world, these have been documented to last for decades. They typically occur in wetlands that have a lot of peat or other organic soil. And then we have rare or infrequent fire, and there are quite a few communities, such as our hammocks throughout the southeast, and our swamps that have very rare fire. And some of these, such as cypress strand swamps in South Florida, when they do burn, every few centuries, it's a stand replacing fire. So again, some overlap among these regimes. Fire adaptive traits, again, the first fire adaptive trait that's well documented in the fossil record, and in this case from a dated phylogeny of pines published by Hay et al., a wonderful paper in New Phytologist, shown here. Fire protective thick bark in pines arose 126 million years ago during the Cretaceous. That's a long time. By 89 million years ago, pines had diverged into two different adaptive peaks or alternative strategies. One was characterized by thick bark and branch shedding. That's our stand maintaining or surface fire regime. And the second, serotiny or closed cones with branch retention, which toasts the adult tree, which helps open those serotinous cones, associated with a crown fire or stand replacing fire regime. Other species besides pines show some of these traits. Oaks, pyrophytic oaks. There's a big spectrum of oaks. Some are very fire sensitive, the mesic oaks. Others, pyrophytic oaks, are well adapted to frequent fire. Here we see a study by Hammond et al. That showed that bark of blackjack oak at the base, the bark is more than half the basal diameter, 55% basically of the basal diameter. And it's thickest at the base, and it tapers quickly as it goes up, because the flame zone in a frequently burned savanna or woodland is around a meter or so. And why expend the energy to develop thick bark and actually restrict your gas exchange if you don't need it? So the bark tapers quickly after about a meter or so above the ground. Resprouting, you've all seen this, a very common trait. In fact, it's an ancestral trait, not just an adaptation to fire. It's also an adaptation to drought. It's also an adaptation for heavy herbivory. But when you see many species converging from different groups showing these kinds of adaptations, the most parsimonious explanation is a fire adaptive trait. And so we know that top kill of woody plants is followed by mobilization of non-structural carbohydrates, which are in the roots and often in specialized underground storage organs, which form new stems and leaves. And as I'll touch on later, this happens much more strongly after dormant season fire than after growing season fire. There's additional fire adaptive traits. This is kind of a cool one. We don't have a lot of examples yet of this, but there haven't been many species studied. But in some species, heat and or smoke stimulate germination of plants from their seed bank. And the chemicals have been identified. They're known as characins, and they seem to mimic an yet unidentified endogenous hormone that stimulates germination and growth. And also, very amazing are these underground storage organs, both generalized like rhizomes and very specialized such as lignotubers. But in some cases, in many grassland savannas around the world, we have this phenomenon of underground forests, where we have what look like herbaceous plants, but have these massive growths, underground storage organs and roots underground, that they're essentially old growth grasslands with individual plants, at least the genettes, that might be thousands of years old in some cases. So we're talking about something analogous to the great coastal redwood forest or the tropical rainforest. And Central Florida, in fact, seems to be the hotspot in North America of these underground forests. And a very well-known adaptation, which in North America is only found in one species of pine, Longleaf, is this extended seedling phase or grass phase, which lasts usually around 5 to 15 years, during which time the juvenile here develops a thick taproot and sends out lateral roots as well. And this is very resistant to fire after the very young seedling stage. Other pines around the world in frequent fire communities show this adaptation. There's a couple in Mexico, a couple in the Caribbean, for example. And also the bolting phase of longleaf pine, extremely rapid growth after they emerge from the grass stage. This is so they can escape damage and mortality from fires that will sweep through. So these bolting trees can grow a meter or more within a single year in some cases. And typically, again, in a well-burned, frequently burned site, the flame zone is on the order of around a meter. So in 1 year, they might be able to escape damage by fire through this kind of bolting growth. And then we've got these species that are a little bit different. They don't fit the model of the two adaptive strategies in pines. Pond pine, it's adapted to a mixed or variable fire regime. It has some characteristics of those frequent fire stand maintaining regimes and other characteristics of the stand replacing regime. For example, one unusual or fairly uncommon adaptation it shows are these epicormic branches that emerge from buds below the bark after extreme heat. That allows for rapid photosynthesis and recovery from fire. But they also show resprouting from the root collar. Very few pines in our region. In fact, within the region I'm focusing on, the lower southeastern coastal plain, Only this species and shortleaf pine show resprouting. Further north, you've got pitch pine and some other resprouters. But then they also have relatively thick bark, which protects them from a typical surface fire or stand maintaining regime. So they can persist in a variable fire regime going from, say, 3 to 30 year intervals. And then undoubtedly the pinnacle of evolution or adaptation to fire is the development of traits that actually facilitate fire. This is an example of niche construction, where species develop traits that actually change the environment to enhance their success. We know that many of our C4 or warm season grasses are very highly flammable. When pine needles fall into this rich matrix of wiregrass and other C4 grasses, you create the perfect environment for frequent surface fire. And in fact, a layer in Platt showed that, let's see if I can get this pointer to work again. There we go. Showed that those pine needles increase the fire temperatures and the duration of heating relative to those herbaceous fuels alone. So the pine needles are a very important part of this niche. There's other ways that plants can promote and facilitate fire. Cabbage palms are, I think many of you probably observed this. They will carry fire up into the canopy, and then they'll toss out flaming firebrands which torch out nearby trees, including potential competitors like oaks, creating open space for their own regeneration. Another amazing adaptation. And then there's animals that show a range of adaptations to fire. Not as well discussed in the literature. There's been a lot more botanists interested in fire adaptation than animals. But ground nesting birds in fiery habitats are adapted to quickly re-nesting when their nests are destroyed by fire. And this is somewhat analogous to resprouting in plants. And they also require fire to maintain an open grassy habitat and will start to leave the site or at least experience less reproductive success as woody species invade. And some of these species, like this Bachman sparrow shown here, will re-nest several times during the nesting season if their nests are destroyed by fire. So a very strong adaptation. Now they also re-nest after predation. So this is an adaptation that's not limited to fire, but fire was undoubtedly one of the major selective pressures. And ornithologists have argued for decades over whether we should burn habitats during the nesting season of ground nesting birds. Some of the pillars of ornithology in the Southeast, such as Herb Stoddard, who studied primarily bobwhite quail, was adamantly opposed to burning during what we now consider the lightning fire season because of the damage to ground nesting birds. However, he eventually came around. He was convinced by evidence showing that the habitat conditions that favor these birds in general, including quail, were better enhanced by growing season fire than dormant season fire. And Jim Cox, for example, with Tall Timbers, has clearly demonstrated this and reviewed the literature. Probably the most frequent fire dependent of all vertebrates in North America. And that's a big statement, but I think this is likely true. The most frequent fire-dependent species of vertebrate I know of is the Florida grasshopper sparrow, which is on the verge of extinction. Only around 100 animals, birds left in the wild right now. It is strongly fire-adapted, and I led a research team that studied them down at Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park in south central Florida. One thing we know is that these birds will shift their territories during the breeding season into areas that have burned just a week or two earlier. They like it right after fire. Minimal vegetation on the ground. No successful reproduction is known for sites that have unburned for as little as 24 months after fire, 2 years. So they require extremely frequent fire. This is an endemic, non-migratory subspecies of the grasshopper sparrow. Very highly specialized on these subtropical hyperseasonal grasslands, also known as dry prairie, in south central Florida. And then there's amphibians. Now this particular study was done by my son, but I assure you I would be citing it even if he weren't my son. They found at Archibald Biological Station that oak toads in ponds that were burned 4 months, 3 to 4 years, and 11 years in the past The oak toads had mean survival significantly higher in the most recently burned ponds. And they, as well as other studies, have shown the likely mechanism for this: burning releases positive cations, which increase the pH of the water in which those the eggs and tadpoles exist, and the metamorphs. And many amphibians are extremely sensitive to acidic waters. They need pH, for example, well above 4 in many cases. So fire helps maintain the pH that they require for survival. So if you're a fire manager, at this point, I would not be at all offended if you're asking, what do evolutionary history, patterns of endemism, fire adaptive traits, fire dependent ecosystems, what does all this have to do with what I face out there on the ground? How often and during what times of the year should I burn the lands I'm responsible for managing? Well, I would answer, if we care about maintaining and restoring native biodiversity and the conditions under which these species evolved and these communities developed, these questions have everything to do with day-to-day management. They really, I think, strengthen the case for management that tries to mimic the evolutionary fire regime. Cecil Frost, who I see is on this call, and he'll be giving a webinar that you should attend in about a month, I guess, a month or so. He has, over many years, used a variety of sources of evidence to map dominant fire regimes across much of the continent, actually, but especially the southeast. And he actually expanded some of his study area to help for my last book, the Forgotten Grasslands book, to the area you see here. What we see is that in the coastal plain, we generally have, in the most fire-exposed landscape positions, fire regimes averaging 1 to 3 years, especially in the lower southeastern part of the region, to 4 to 6 years. Again, in these dominant uplands or fire-exposed sites with large fire compartments. Now this is, a coarse scale map, and so within this landscape, there are many local areas that have much, much longer fire regimes. This is kind of a regional average. And recent fire scar research by Jeanne Hoffman, among others, has shown that, well, it's basically validated the estimates provided by Cecil Frost. For example, Jeanne Hoffman, in her dissertation, the work particularly in St. Joseph Bay, fire scars showed a 2 to 3 year fire return interval between 1679 and 1868. Variability in this case was extremely low. 92% of all fires occurring at less than 5-year intervals. This is in contrast to some work done in the further west, like in central Louisiana by Stambaugh and colleagues, where they found high variability, but also a very high frequency. Dendropyrochronology, a big word. Additional studies by Jeanne Hoffman and, in this case, Bill Platt in south central Florida at Avon Park Air Force Range found, as you can see here, vast majority of fires occurred at 1 year intervals. Now this is looking at 151 samples over 222 years. Mean fire interval over that 220-year period was 1.19 years. The median, 1.13. This is a very high fire landscape. The same general landscape, by the way, as the Florida dry prairie in which the Florida grasshopper sparrow evolved. So probably the highest fire part of our entire southeastern coastal plain region. But even further north, far away from here, the Green Swamp Preserve in North Carolina is famous for having the highest fine-scale plant species richness known for North America, with some 1 meter square plots holding more than 50 vascular plant species, which is world-class. It's up there in the top 2 or 3 areas globally. In a recent study, Kyle Palmquist and co-authors found that even a deviation of 1 year from annual burning resulted in reduced plant species richness. So annual burning was necessary here to maintain the very high species richness. Frankly, I would not have expected that this far north in an area that doesn't naturally experience as much ignition as, for example, in Florida. But ignitions throughout, well, fires throughout the southeastern coastal plain have declined due to a number of different factors. Some of these we recognize as active fire exclusion. We prevent fire from coming into areas, and then we fight those fires. We put them out as quickly as we can. We're all familiar with that, and I'm sure many of you do this largely for a living. But there's another kind of fire exclusion which is actually more pervasive, that's probably resulted in more lost fire from the southeastern landscape. That's passive fire exclusion. This occurs when landscapes are fragmented and fire does not flow over miles and miles and miles like it once did before at least Euro-American settlement. So both kinds of fire exclusion have resulted in much less fire and a lower fire frequency in general across the region. Now, in terms of fire season, again, one of these big areas of controversy, if fire, and I am going to state here a hypothesis, and the premise is that if fire is an important agent of selection, I hope you've seen the evidence that it is, some of that evidence, and if fires were concentrated in a particular season during the evolution of these species, then we would expect that species would have evolved mechanisms of growth and reproduction that are timed to respond to seasonal cues. So this leads to a management-relevant hypothesis that burning during the evolutionary fire season provides conservation and restoration benefits, including higher fitness of fire-adapted species, additive to those achieved by burning at the evolutionary fire frequency. So that's a little wordy, but the key term is additive. So it's cool if we're burning frequently enough, but would it be even cooler if we burned during the evolutionary or lightning fire season? So, there's evidence on both sides, as we'll soon see, but in general, I think this hypothesis is being supported. Now, Ed Komaric, back in 1964, published this. This is an adaptation of a redrawing of his graph, but he showed that there is a mismatch between the months with the greatest lightning fires and the months with the highest incidence of thunderstorm days in Florida. And this is data from the Florida Forest Service over just 2 years, 62 to 63. And so the idea that Komaric developed here is that at this time we have lightning thunderstorms rapidly increasing, but the vegetation is still dry from the spring, or in some case winter and spring drought. So the vegetation has very low fuel moisture, very susceptible to ignition. Now I should add here that some other studies, for example, one done by Brian Duncan and colleagues in East Central Florida, showed the highest incidence of lightning fires in July. In fact, a strong peak in July. So this general pattern is not invariable. And in fact, Duncan's study was based on 16 years of lightning data. Also, I had to cut this presentation back a bit because of time. I'm still probably going to go over. But one slide I wish I'd left in was a slide that showed, and this was taken from the very important report by Louise Robbins and Ron Myers, published in 1992 out of Tall Timbers on seasonal effects of fire. But they showed that across the National Forest of Florida, both lightning fires and human fires were strongly concentrated in May, thus validating Komaric's original hypothesis. And the important point here, that was area burned, I should have added. And so more important than the number of fires is the area burned by fire. And what Robbins and Myers showed is that peaks in May. So this period around May, as shown here in this figure from Hoffman, is that these are the dots are successive days without significant rainfall. The bars, histogram here, type bars, are lightning incidents. And so we see here a period centered in May when the vegetation is dry, not much rain, and lightning is increasing rapidly. That explains a lot of the fire at that season. The most thorough explanation and portrayal of the lightning fire season was provided in a recent paper by Bill Platt and all. Bill Platt, Steve Orzel, Matt Slocum. And basically going counterclockwise here, we have a wet season in blue, and each dot here is a weather day over 13 years of data using daily weather data. Okay, and dots close together, that cluster close together have similar weather conditions. Okay, so wet season, blue. We proceed to the transition between the wet and dry season, which is in red, and finally to the gray, which is the wet season of summer, especially midsummer into early fall. The bubbles here are individual fire events, with the size of the bubble representing the size of the fire. And this particular graph is for lightning fires only. And we can see at Avon Park, where there's not been as much suppression as in many areas, most of the fires, as well as the largest fires, occurred during this transition season between the dry season in blue and the wet season in gray. And this was a season characterized by drought, as we show here, intense solar radiation, low humidity, and warm air temperatures, perfectly conducive to fire. Fire scar data back this up. At St. Joe Bay Savannah, Hoffman found that between 1592 and 1830, lightning season fires were the only fires recorded as fire scars in the rings of pine. Only after 1830 did we see fires during the dormant season, and those were presumably caused by humans. Now, as we all know, prescribed burning in the past, done by many cattlemen, but by the Indians largely, and by foresters, and still today by most land managers, most fires are set in the winter. And so on the state forest in Florida, these are data that Dennis Hardin put together from fiscal year 2000, 2001 to 2007 and 2009, we see that fires that were accomplished, prescribed burns, were mostly in January and February. So this is percentage of basically prescribed burns that actually happened after being planned. The lowest number is in May, which again might be the optimal time for prescribed burning from an evolutionary perspective. So we know species have evolved adaptations to fire. And if fire varies seasonally, these adaptations should include responses to seasonality. We know a distinct fire season exists. We know that many species, not all, but many respond most positively to fire in the lightning fire season, and often less beneficial effects outside of this. Very importantly, only during the lightning fire season, usually, do fires burn across wetlands, reducing woody encroachment and maintaining open water. So, for example, classic study in the Santee fire plots of South Carolina. This was a long-term study. This particular graph is after 30 years. The entire study extended to 43 years, but after 30 years, you can see here that annual winter burning produced the greatest resprouting of hardwood stems, especially in black hair sweet gum, which, as many of you know, can be a real problem if we're trying to manage and maintain pine savanna conditions. Annual summer fire produced the least resprouting of these hardwoods. I should add that after 43 years, in their final paper, they found that both the annual winter and the annual summer regimes produced this grassy herbaceous cover characteristic of the pre-settlement landscape. However, those hardwood stems were still lurking in the annual winter burn plots. And so Waldrop and co-authors reasoned that if they stopped burning for even a few years, those areas would quickly convert to a shrub-dominated state. Many studies since then have confirmed some of the mechanisms, but basically resprouting of woody plants is less vigorous during seasons when the carbohydrate reserves are low. That makes sense. And in the coastal plain, that's the lightning fire season, which again, depending on exactly where you are, ranges from late April through July. But again, concentrated in May and June. A number of studies that I can't review the details, but have found that many grasses as well as forbs in these grassland savanna systems flower more after growing season burns or lightning season burns than after dormant season burns, as well as a number of other positive effects. The classic case of this, which we all know of, are the two species of wiregrass, where we rarely see flowering except after lightning season or later in the growing season fires. This species is very closely tied in its phenology to fire at this season. Since wiregrass actually has been known to show this for many decades, but more recently, many other warm season or C4 grasses of the coastal plain have been shown to show similar responses, with just a few exceptions. There are a few exceptions. And often a picture is worth 1,000 words, as the old saying goes. Here we are at the Wade Tract, very famous Wade Tract in southern Georgia. And this photo is courtesy of Jim Cox at Tall Timbers. But here we have a mowed fire line, the way they should be. On the left side, a site burned April 5th of 2009, in this case, kind of in the late dormant season of that year. Another site on the other side of the road, same community, burned just 19 days later, April 24th, 2009. And then this photo is taken, it looks like in the fall. And you can see the strong difference in response. Mostly here, what we're seeing is the flowering stems of wiregrass. I mentioned amphibians as being fire sensitive. They're also sensitive to fire season. And one of the most sensitive appears to be, again, these two species of flatwood salamanders, both of which are listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. These flatwood salamanders migrate into their breeding ponds in the fall, and then they migrate out after mating and laying their eggs. And this is concentrated in November, but it occurs between October and January. Okay, then their larvae develop, the eggs hatch, and the metamorphs leave the ponds in March and April. So basically, if you burn during that period, you have a good chance of increasing mortality for these salamanders. But more importantly, these salamanders their movements are impeded by the growth of woody shrubs. And we know that lightning season fire does a better job, as I've just shown you, many studies show, of reducing these woody stems than dormant season fire. So this is a species, again, of animal very tied to the lightning fire season. But there is, of course, another side of this story. There are some valid reasons for burning outside of the lightning fire season. For one, not even mentioned here, but most species haven't even been studied. We don't even know what their seasonal response is. But we know that many, perhaps even most species of plants in particular, don't show strong differences between lightning season fires and fires in other seasons, at least if the latter are as frequent or as intense. Now, there are some important exceptions, some of which we've referred to already. There is some evidence of negative effects of lightning season fire on particular species, higher mortality of pines perhaps, but this tends to happen more in the fall, actually, according to most evidence. But also, most of this has been refuted, but as I mentioned earlier, Herb Stoddard's concern about quail. It turns out the quail actually do better, but there are some imperiled species of birds that are so rare, including now the Florida grasshopper sparrow, where burning within their nesting habitat during their nesting season would not be a good idea. And so the Endangered Species Act is sometimes called on to prevent burning during these periods. And then there's air quality. There's legal requirements. The ESA I mentioned, the Clean Air Act, burn bans, instituted, I should say, by forestry agencies that strongly discourage burning during the lightning season. And then there are a variety of legitimate practical considerations: manageability of the fire, liability concerns, the safety and the comfort of the fire crews. But there's some other things that could be changed under the right conditions: politics, agency culture, and tradition. These tend to change slowly, but they're not immutable. One interesting study showed among legumes that, and this was, I believe, at Eglin Air Force Base, or maybe it was at, I'll have to go back and look. In any case, it might have been at the Jones Center. But in any case, in this case, legumes showed a highly variable response to fire season. Some actually had higher reproductive success after dormant season burns. Others after growing season or lightning season burns. Others didn't show any particular effect. And many, in fact, showed greater flowering after years with no burns, which is, again, contrary to the usual pattern that we see. But it does show that there's always exceptions. And it does provide at least some argument for a variable fire season, as Kevin Hires and co-authors suggested here. And there's other arguments, some of which that have been made, some of which are more valid than others. One I referred to earlier, this idea, which now is, I think, pretty much discredited, that the longleaf pine ecosystem is very recent. There were certainly antecedents to this system. We don't know yet for certain if they were longleaf pine, but they were ecologically equivalent. This one here, indigenous people exerted significant control over fire regimes and influenced natural selection. This could have happened in some cases, but again, the evidence suggests this was probably very rare. This one, I think, is valid. Variation in the amount of fuel, fuel moisture, wind speed, etc. may obscure or accentuate seasonal differences. And related to that, intensity is more important than seasonality. And in fact, I probably should change this maybe to probably, because some recent reviews have shown that across North America, the intensity of fire seems to be more important to most species than the season or the timing of the fire. But again, the two are confounded or strongly correlated, so it's often difficult to tease them apart. The most important reason, though, I think you all recognize, winter fires are critical for adding burn days, keeping fire on the ground. It's much better to burn during the winter in particular than to forego burning another year in most cases. So we do, I think, need winter fires in many cases to keep enough fire on the landscape. We just need a lot more growing season fire as well, in my opinion. So to conclude here with some implications for management, frequency usually trumps seasonality, but maybe not always over the long term. If we burn for many years outside the lightning fire season, we may see cumulative negative effects that we're not going to notice in the short term, maybe even after decades. Although, as I showed, many native species respond about equally well to fire during any time of year. The foundation species, the dominant species of these southeastern savannas and grasslands, such as wiregrass and other C4 grasses, with very few exceptions, respond most favorably to early growing season or lightning fire season fires. But still, we all know the objectives of a particular prescribed burn, for example, restoration versus maintenance, may dictate burning outside the lightning fire season, as well as a number of practical concerns. So, in the face of all this remaining uncertainty, and there is quite a bit, I would suggest we follow an ecologically and evolutionarily informed precautionary principle. Okay, so my final point here was that there are a number of cases where winter burns are the best way to meet particular objectives, especially for restoration. In this particular case, Eric Menges at Archibald Biological Station was the burn boss, and the objective was to restore scrub that had gone unburned for several decades, and they chose a dry winter day, and Eric has shown that in scrub, at least on the Lake Wales Ridge, that fire is more intense, at least in terms of temperature, during the winter than typically during the growing season. So this fire met the objectives. I actually visited the site about a week after the burn, and then again a few months later. Regeneration was excellent. It helped clean out a lot of the so-called decadent material, and the scrub is looking in much better shape after this restoration burn. So one of those examples of where winter fire is the best for meeting your management objectives. On the other hand, again, there's many others that argue for lightning season fire. So I see some questions here. One from, let's see, Diana. What are the negative aspects of burning C4 grasses during the fall and winter? Fall in Florida, I'm sorry. Well, one thing that I've heard from my colleagues, Edwin Bridges and Steve Orzel, for example, among others, is that especially when the water levels are high later in the growing season or wet season, you can have pretty much complete mortality of many of the grasses because they're right after fire, they're drowned and they don't resprout well. That's not a highly technical suggestion, but I've seen some of their photos and other photos, and I've seen a few examples myself in the field where people have burned, say, in August or September, and there seems to be a lot of mortality of C4 grasses. So burning earlier in the growing season before water levels are so high is a real good idea. I also see, yeah, Edwin actually answered Diana's. They burn up all the seeds, and that's another important point. If the grasses are flowering during the time that you burn the stand, you may get essentially no reproduction that year. Paula Benshoff added that sandhill cranes nesting, negative effects of burning wetlands in February and March. So that's a very good example. These cranes nest early, so you want to avoid burning during that time, as well as some raptors. Many raptors nest early. Some of them nest close to the ground. Edwin Bridges also pointed out large seed crops in fall are important to wintering birds. And in fact, most grasses and other graminoids and other plants that produce seeds that are used by our wintering birds produce those seeds in the fall. And so if you burn them up, the wintering birds are going to have a lot less to eat. And this is critical because in our Florida grasslands and savannas especially, winter is the time with the highest species richness and biomass of birds. And it can be on the order of 7 times what it is during the breeding season. And we see that in pine flatwoods. We see it in Florida dry prairie. So you need to keep the seeds around for those birds and not burn them up late in the summer or during the fall. Let's see what else we've got. Here's questions. Okay, so yes, Kevin England had noted, how about these types of burns for sandstone glades and barrens? Well, if those are a special case, these communities, glades with very thin soils, they do burn naturally. I've seen glades after fire, and they recover, from what I've observed, pretty well. But fire for many of these systems is not the dominant force that produces and maintains them over time. It's more the very thin soils and the strong contrast between very wet soils during the winter and then drier soils during summer drought in those cases. So this has been called xerohydric or hydroxeric types of conditions. So you get these plant species that are highly specialized and adapted to these extremes of very dry and very wet and very thin soils. So fire burns into these communities from the surrounding pyrogenic uplands when those uplands exist. But I've seen glades, for example, that are surrounded by closed forest, mesic forest, that burn very rarely, if at all, and yet are able to maintain their species composition for long periods of time. And in fact, some of these glades, especially because they're out of equilibrium with the regional climate, are thought to be very ancient, going back to at least middle Pleistocene, if not earlier. What else do we have here? We have from Joe R., can you please explain the lack of charcoal in sediments? It stumps me since I see charcoal production on almost every prescribed fire. Well, charcoal is produced by surface fires, but it doesn't necessarily make it into the wetlands from which cores are taken. And that seems to be part of the problem. And one explanation for this is that the dense vegetation around many wetlands inhibits the flow of charcoal during rain events into them. I'm not sure I completely buy that. I haven't seen the evidence, but it is very clear for savanna regions around the world that a frequent fire regime, which is burning primarily herbaceous matter, does not produce nearly as much charcoal that enters the air column or otherwise flows into wetlands where it might be recovered in sediment cores, as you have when you burn woody fuels. Now, I know that in South Africa and some other areas around the world, they're getting better charcoal records from savanna-type fire from deep ocean sediments. So some of that charcoal is finding its way high in the atmosphere and then raining out into the ocean. It's an area that has not those questions have not been fully answered, frankly. But we do know that surface fire regimes produce a very poor charcoal record compared to most like crown fire or other woody fuel fire regimes. Another question, let's see, from Jen Costanza. Has anyone quantified the relative effects of passive versus active fire suppression on the current fire regime? That's an excellent question. Jen, I don't think anybody has quantified this. I mean, just looking at, you know, history of development in various landscapes, agricultural development, and now, of course, more recently, urban development, it would appear that passive fire exclusion through fragmentation is an even bigger factor than active. And in fact, writing back in 1911, Roland Harper, one of the premier early fire ecologists, noted that roads and agricultural fields and other barriers impede the spread of fire across the region. So he was really the first person to bring up, to my knowledge, to bring up this problem of passive fire exclusion. He didn't use that term, but he was well aware of the phenomenon. So it was common even back then when the landscape was less fragmented than now. Other questions, let's see here. What have I missed? Paula Benshoff. You never hear about absolute humidity versus relative humidity. There's far more water in the air at 50% relative humidity and 90 degrees Fahrenheit in spring than 50% humidity at 50. That's a good point. This is one reason you can get more severe fires in winter. And she cites here Robert Dye. I think that's a really good point, Paula. And yes, your relative humidity is going to be higher in the spring than in the summer. Let's see here. Let's get down to, let's see, Todd Angel asked, the interesting thing or comments, we only have this conversation about fire seasonality of fire here in the Southeast because we can. In most other systems in North America, there isn't an option to burn outside of the evolutionary fire season. That's a very, very good point. There's too much snow in the Mountain West, for example, to burn during the winter. So they do any burning that they do, for example, in ponderosa pine, generally during the summer, which is the evolutionary fire season there. There it's a little later in the summer season than here. Eric Ungberg asked, do you think that the high fine-scale diversity in North Carolina is artificial? It seems you were maybe surprised about the frequency of fire this far north. That's interesting. It is, of course, conceivable that human management, burning even more often than the lightning fire regime would allow, might enhance diversity above natural levels. So I think we can leave that as an open hypothesis. But you're right. Lightning is not as dominant there, although still, you know, if you look across these landscapes of the Southeast, even those with less lightning, before landscape fragmentation, the fire compartments were still immense. So fire would have spread for long areas. You didn't need many ignitions for fire to cover huge areas, and fires would burn for weeks to even months. And that's a very important point that I think many people miss today, is that, you know, we're not burning small fire compartments in the past like we are today. We had natural barriers to fire. Don't get me wrong. We had large river valleys. We had steep slopes, but nothing like we have today. So yeah, it is possible that we've increased fire frequency in some areas above the lightning regime. Maynard Hiss mentions prescribed fires are typically one fire for a burn compartment, but I think natural fires may have burned multiple fires during the year in the same burn area. That's another good point. You may have had several lightning storms from spring through summer that burned various parts of a fire compartment. And, you know, the old understanding was that you couldn't burn a lot of these communities more than once every several years because you needed the fuel to build up. But we've now shown that there's many areas that can burn as frequently as every 6 months, and especially if you have a heterogeneous burn, there's a lot of herbaceous material in particular that did not burn during the first fire that can burn during subsequent fires. And in fact, if I look at some of the accounts of the cattlemen, for example, they often burned a couple times a year. And they would burn what lightning fires didn't burn. And so we do have situations where we can burn multiple times during the year, and presumably this could have benefits, especially given that different species have different seasonal optima for seasonality. Let me see, what other questions? Okay, Jordan Nanny, will forb coverage increase following late growing season fire if C4 grass coverage decreases? I would, let me defer that question to Edwin Bridges in particular, if he's still on. You know, theoretically, if grasses suffered, forbs might increase, right? We see that with, for example, with some grazing regimes and with some off-hire regimes in tallgrass prairie. I'm not sure how much of that we're seeing around here. Let's see. Alex asks, can you give an example of the difference between intensity and severity? Okay, well, intensity has often been measured by fire temperature, say at the ground surface or at some height. Generally, researchers now are in mostly in consensus that fire line intensity, that temperature of the moving fire front, is the best measure of intensity, but there's problems with that. Severity is not a measure of temperature. It is a measure of the effects on vegetation, or more generally on biomass. And sometimes you can have higher severity and lower intensity. For example, a relatively cooler fire that moves very slowly with a long residence time may penetrate deeper into the duff and ultimately the soil, and could even impact the seed bank more, depending on other conditions, than a very hot fire. So severity and intensity are sometimes correlated, but sometimes not. It's an area, again, that the chief expert on this, who's defined those terms very carefully recently, is John Keeley at the USGS out in California. But the interpretation I just gave you was basically from him. Let's see here. Maynard, okay, I covered that. Cindy, Cindy T, what might we look for to investigate the historic fire frequency in wet scrub areas in northeastern Florida? As far as looking at historic fire frequency, and by historic here, I'm thinking maybe you're talking about pre-European. Basically, what we had to go in there, since we lack a lot of direct evidence for questions like this, we go with what ecologists and managers have observed as the most favorable responses of the vegetation, and sometimes of particular species. And so, for example, the Florida Natural Areas Inventory, in their 2010 updated Guide to the Natural Communities of Florida, reviewed the literature and gives a range of fire intervals for various natural communities across the state of Florida. There's also other literature from other states that summarizes or reviews literature on fire intervals. And that's basically, some is based on historic accounts, of early botanists, for example, but a lot is based just on what we're seeing now in terms of responses of the vegetation. Let's see. David Godwin mentions that Kevin Hires suggests I discuss dramatic shifts in oaks and pine from Lake Tulane that represent big climate swings versus the diverse patterns of pollen from the Camel Lake and others further north. It is clear that climate changes rapidly during the Pleistocene, but it may not be reasonable to suggest the species or communities are the same at each successive invasion during the Pleistocene, and cites a paper by Watts. Well, the big problem here, Kevin and others, is that we haven't done fossil pollen DNA analysis. And so all we have, with very few exceptions, are data on the relative abundance of various genera of plants, such as oaks versus pines, over time. And so we don't know, for example, for certain if the oak phases in central Florida, like on the Lake Wales Ridge, are oak scrub, which we thought they were in the past, or whether they represent dry prairie, subtropical hyperseasonal grassland, or perhaps an oak savanna type of situation. And the latter two options seem more reasonable because grasses peaked at the same time as the oaks, not the same time as the pines, which was a big surprise. Now, further north at Camel Lake, you see the same, this is in the Panhandle, actually within Apalachicola National Forest. You see the same kind of cycling. Up there, though, you've got influence of more temperate tree taxa. And you also have, at this site alone, a significant percent of spruce pollen. And that presence of spruce pollen led some early researchers to conclude that this was boreal forest during the last glacial maximum in northern Florida. That has been corrected. That was Ed Devey in 1949 first suggested that. But if you look at the rest of the taxa there, the species that are most abundant at the site at the time that spruce was found are temperate hardwoods. So basically what we had was a no analog community of temperate hardwoods, but with some spruce. And Eric Grimm, the paleontologist, has told me, personal communication, that he suspects the spruce was not a northern spruce. It was Picea crisfeldii, which is a coastal plain endemic spruce, which is now extinct, but is also found, for example, in the Mississippi River drainage. I don't know if I totally answered your question, but the big point here is that it's difficult to make detailed interpretations based just on genera. And there is a definite difference between North Florida and northward versus Central Florida and southward. Okay, Edwin Bridges answering, I think, Hires notes that Wells noted the higher frequency in North Carolina in the 1920s, which is true. Wells was a little bit schizophrenic about fire. Sometimes he recognized the importance of fire. Other times he called fire the demon. So it's difficult to tell what he really thought. Mike Oliver, in southeast Texas, we have a lot of fragmentation, urbanization, particularly in the area of the Big Thicket. Yes, so that's why I think you see in the Big Thicket area much denser vegetation than what you would have had there historically with the natural fire regime, where the area was probably largely, if not entirely, longleaf pine savanna. Okay, what else? Okay, oh, somebody asked when my new book will be available. It's been a bit delayed because some of the reviews are delayed, unfortunately. So far it's about 3 months delayed. I thought it was going to come out in 2017. I'm now thinking, with luck, early 2018. Oh, I see that David answered that question. Okay, I think those are most of the substantive questions. I probably missed one or two, but I think that was basically it. So again, for those of you remaining, thanks very much for participating. I see there's still 125 people, so great. Thanks for sticking it out.
So thank you very much, Reed. Enjoyed your presentation. Hope you'll come back and join us. And thank you everyone who joined us today, and have a good afternoon.
Bye, everybody.